Let's look at a tale of two states, Utah and North Dakota. Utah is perpetually last in the nation in per pupil funding. So what would it take to reach average? Utah's below the national average in per pupil funding by $3,642. Think about that for a second. Multiplied by our nearly 600,000 students in kindergarten through 12th grade, that's nearly $2.2 billion just to get to average. Now, I know most of you in the morning send your children out the door and say, honey, do your best to be average today. It takes $2.2 billion just to get to average in per pupil funding. Some people have talked about eliminating the personal exemption. Well, that might raise $10, $20, $30 million. Some people have talked about taxing the rich. Let's double the income tax on the wealthy, never mind the adverse effect that could have on the economy. Well, that might raise $50 or $100 million. That still leaves us $2 billion away from average. This is not going to be solved by shuffling scarce budget dollars around. We need to take bold, innovative steps to secure the same rights that other states have in educating their students. So let's look at North Dakota. While so many states languish in this economic downturn, North Dakota is thriving. Well, why is that? Because North Dakota has access to its lands and its resources. The federal government honored the promise to extinguish title, to dispose of title to the public lands at statehood. And so North Dakota has 18,000 jobs just looking for people. North Dakota added $1.2 billion to roads and to school buildings. They added $3,700 over and above the national average per pupil in funding for education directly into the classroom. North Dakota has 11.6 students per teacher. Imagine what education would look like in Utah if we could cut the class size in half. So it takes us $2.2 billion just to get to average in per pupil funding, and it takes another $2.2 billion to compete with our neighboring states that have access to their lands and resources. So our funding gap for education in Utah is more than $4.4 billion. There's no simple solution. As Ronald Reagan said, there are no easy answers, but there are simple ones. Access to our lands and to our resources, compelling the federal government to honor the same promises that it made and kept with all states east of Colorado and with Hawaii. We have the resources if we have the will. In fact, looking at the Enabling Acts, side by side, you have the Utah Enabling Act on the left, the Enabling Acts of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington on the right. The language is virtually word for word identical. The promises are the same, that the federal government promised to extinguish title to the public lands at statehood in a timely fashion. They did that with North and South Dakota. With Utah, not so much. The Enabling Act of Utah specifically provides that the federal government will extinguish title to the lands, that they're subject to disposition, meaning to dispose of title to the land. Utah agreed to suspend its sovereign right to tax the land, only so long as the federal government timely disposes of the land. We never agreed that the federal government never disposes of the land, therefore we could never tax the land, never have the benefit of the resources to educate our children, to provide for essential government services. Now, some people have pointed to that first sentence in the Enabling Act and said, look, you forever disclaimed all right and title to the unappropriated lands. You have nothing to complain about. Well, guess what? Remember those terms that were exactly the same? North Dakota made the same promise. So did South Dakota and Oklahoma and Iowa and all the others. That provision is merely in there so that the states give all right they may have in those lands to the federal government, so that when they extinguish title, when they transfer away title, there's no superior claim to the third parties that get title to that land. It's kind of like a quitclaim to clean up title to that land. It never did away with the federal government's duty, their trust obligation, to dispose of that land in a timely fashion. So looking at the Enabling Act, under Section 3, the federal government has a duty to extinguish title, to dispose of title to all the public lands. Now in Section 9, we see that while they're extinguishing title to all those lands, if they sell lands, 5% of the proceeds of the sale of the public lands, which shall be sold by the United States, shall be paid to the permanent fund for the support of our common schools. The promises are the same, but look at the difference. For all states east of Colorado, the federal government did honor its promise. The same promise made to Utah and to Arizona and to New Mexico and to Idaho and to Nevada. and yet the federal government didn't honor the promises there. The federal government didn't honor its promise to Utah, and so Utah is $2.2 billion away from average in per pupil funding for its children. Utah's another $2.2 billion away from competing with states where the federal government did honor its promise, and they do have access to their lands and their resources to provide jobs, to generate a tax base, to fund essential government services. So where's the line for adequately educating our children, for unleashing full employment in our state, for growing the economic pie not only in our state, but also throughout the nation, and for securing the self-determination of our state? So here's the line, the arbitrary line. For all of the states east of Colorado, the promise was the same, and the federal government honored that promise to timely dispose of title to all the public lands. For all the states west, the promise is the same, only the performance is different. What's really interesting is a lot of people say, well, you states in the west are just different somehow, without explaining why. And yet look at Hawaii, to our far west. The federal government disposed of all of the land to Hawaii, and they control all of their lands and all of their resources. And yet somehow, our children in Utah aren't as good as the children in North Dakota. Our children aren't as good as the children in Kansas or in Oklahoma. Our children aren't entitled to have the same opportunities to responsibly manage the resources and responsibly manage our lands, to provide for education, to provide for a growing economy, and to provide for the self-determination of our state. Now, not only do we face the challenge of being $2.2 billion away from average in per pupil funding, of being another $2.2 billion away from our neighboring states in per pupil funding, we also face the tremendous challenge where nearly 40% of our state budget comes from a federal government that is in the financial condition that it's in. We'll stand to account for not taking adequate preparation to secure our budget, to secure our revenues, to secure our resources for the long-term viability and security of our state. President Barack Obama appointed Erskine Bowles, the former chief of staff for President Bill Clinton, and Alan Simpson, a former Republican senator from Wyoming, as the co-chairs of his National Fiscal Responsibility Commission to study our financial situation and look at potential solutions. They studied the issue for more than a year and reported their findings to the Senate Budget Committee March 8th of 2011. Here's what they had to say.
I think we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. A lot of us sitting in this room didn't see this last crisis as it came upon us, but this one is really easy to see. The fiscal path we are on today is simply not sustainable. This debt and these deficits that we are incurring on an annual basis are like a cancer, and they are truly going to destroy this country from within unless we have the common sense to do something about it. The problem we're going to have to face up to, it may be 2 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But if our bankers over there in Asia begin to believe that we're not going to be solid on our debt, that we're not going to be able to meet our obligations, just stop and think for a minute what happens if they just stop buying our debt. What happens to interest rates? And what happens to the U.S. economy? The markets will absolutely devastate us if we don't step up to this problem. The problem is real, the solutions are painful, and we have to act.
America are way ahead of all of you. They know what's going on, because when you say, why don't you go back and think of what people are doing at their kitchen table? I'll tell you what they're doing at their kitchen table. They know that if you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And they know that if you spend $1 and borrow 40 cents of it, you must be stupid. And they've got it figured out that this government is stupid. To borrow 40 cents for every $1 you spend, forget the charts, forget the GDP, all the rest of it. That's where we are.
So did Congress heed the warning of Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson last March? Well, you know what happened in August. In debating the debt ceiling, they kicked that can down the road to a super committee. The super committee failed, and now we know that we're going to face at least 9% across the board cuts starting in 2013. So of our $5.2 billion, of our $12 billion budget, we already know we're going to face at least 9% across the board cuts starting in 2013. and it could only get worse from there. In December of 2011, David Walker spoke to nearly 600 state legislators and had this to say: if we don't start to immediately reform entitlements, cut federal spending, increase revenues, we have about 3 years until we face a total fiscal collapse. And as to you states that get 30 to 50% of your state budgets from the federal government, you've seen the high water mark. It's only down from here. Now, just very recently, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke testified to the Senate Budget Committee on the continued worsening of our financial crisis at the federal level. He said we face a heightened risk of a sudden fiscal crisis. How wise is it to rely on nearly 40% of our budget on a federal government in that condition? We have the resources if we have the will. Just like in North Dakota, where they have 18,000 jobs just looking for people, they're adding $1.2 billion into roads and school buildings. They've added $3,700 per pupil to their school funding when they were already at the national average. We have the resources if we have the will. We have the ability to unleash not only economic vibrance in Utah, but for the nation, to solve national unemployment problems, to solve national economy problems, if we simply have the federal government honor the same promises it made to all the other states. Less than 2 years ago, the United States Supreme Court addressed the solemn compacts, the solemn promises of a States Enabling Act. In fact, the unanimous Supreme Court said this: the consequences of admission are instantaneous, and it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress can diminish what was bestowed to a state at statehood. And then they added this statement: and this applies with even greater force and effect where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. Think about what they said. Subsequent acts of Congress can't change the vested rights of a States Enabling Act. Think about what those are. The right to have the federal government dispose of all the public land in a timely fashion, just like it did with all the states east of Colorado and with Hawaii. The right to have the federal government pay 5% of the proceeds of any sale of the public lands to the Permanent Fund for Education, so we can increase per pupil funding to our students so they have the same opportunity of students in states east of Colorado where the federal government did honor its promise. The right to then tax those lands and to generate revenues to fund education and to provide essential government services. The right to unleash those resources to employ our citizens and to unleash economic activity that lifts our economy not only in Utah but throughout the nation. And the right to sovereign control of our land so that we can manage, by Utahns, for Utahns, open space and access to our beautiful lands that are our unique heritage, local control and sustained yield of our natural resources. Are we not a state? Are our children not as good as the children in North Dakota? Are we not entitled to have the federal government honor the same promises it made to all states east of Colorado and to Hawaii? Are we not entitled to unleash the abundant resources we have in a responsible manner to grow our economy, and not just our economy, but to grow the economy throughout the nation as the federal government honors its promise to the western states?